Silver closed this week at $94.17 per troy ounce. Let that number sit with you for a moment, not because it's a record, not because some analyst on television called it, but because of what that number is pricing in right now, this weekend, while the markets are dark and the warships are not. As of Friday's close, the United States Fifth Fleet had repositioned 2 carrier strike groups within the Persian Gulf operational theater. The USS Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group and a second surface action group operating under MCON, emissions control, meaning minimal electronic signature, minimal communication, maximum ambiguity. That is not a training posture. That is a pre-strike posture. Simultaneously, Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei delivered a statement through state media that was not translated by most Western outlets with adequate precision. The Persian language version carried a phrase that Iranian diplomatic analysts have historically associated with one specific condition, the authorization of asymmetric retaliation against what Tehran calls illegitimate foreign military presence in the Gulf. That phrase, in prior instances, preceded both the 2019 tanker attacks and the January 2020 ballistic missile strikes on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq. The markets closed before anyone had time to price this fully. Silver ran to $94 on incomplete information. What happens when Comex opens on Monday morning with a full weekend of potential military escalation behind it is what we are going to analyze carefully and without exaggeration right now. The window is narrowing, the clock is ticking, and the next 72 hours may determine whether this is a crisis that gets managed or a crisis that gets remembered. To understand what the market is pricing, you have to understand the sequence of events that built to this moment, because no single incident created this situation. This is a structural escalation that has been building across 18 months of compounding pressure. The immediate trigger, the proximate cause that sent silver through $90 and toward $94 this week, was the confirmed destruction of an Iranian Shahed 238 drone strike on a U.S. logistics facility in northeastern Jordan, the third such strike in 6 weeks. Unlike the January 2024 Tower 22 attack that killed 3 U.S. service members, this strike was larger in scope. 14 personnel were injured. More critically, satellite imagery confirmed the strike targeted a fuel and ammunition forward staging point, not a general support facility. That distinction matters enormously to military planners. An attack on logistics infrastructure is not harassment. It is an attempt to degrade operational capacity before a larger confrontation. Washington responded not with airstrikes inside Iran proper, as it had declined to do in prior cycles, but with something potentially more consequential, the formal designation of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force as a direct combatant actor under the authorization for use of military force. That legal designation, buried in a Friday afternoon briefing document, changes the rules of engagement available to U.S. commanders in theater. They no longer require National Command Authority approval for individual strikes against IRGC aerospace assets. The decision authority has been pushed down the chain. Iran read that designation correctly. Within 36 hours, the IRGC Navy began what Iranian state media called defensive maritime exercises in the northern Strait of Hormuz, deploying fast attack craft, sea mine laying vessels, and mobile anti-ship missile batteries along the Iranian coastline facing the strait's critical 33-kilometer navigable channel. This is not posturing in isolation, this is the architecture of closure. Iran has rehearsed Hormuz interdiction repeatedly over the past decade. The world has treated those rehearsals as theater. This weekend, for the first time, the rehearsal is happening while U.S. carrier strike groups are in direct proximity, and legal authorities for engagement have been formally expanded. That is what silver is pricing. That is what gold at $3,400 is pricing. And that is why the question of what happens when Comex opens on Monday is not an academic question. It is a live operational variable. Let's get into the technical reality, because the popular narrative around an Iran conflict tends to collapse into 2 false poles. Either Iran is dismissed as a minor military actor, or it is portrayed as some invincible asymmetric threat. Neither is accurate. The real picture is more specific, more dangerous, and more instructive. Iran's primary offensive capability in a Hormuz scenario rests on three integrated systems. First, the Noor and Qadr families of anti-ship cruise missiles, Iranian domestic derivatives of the Chinese C-802, with ranges between 120 and 300 kilometers, flying at sea-skimming altitude, approximately 5 to 10 meters above the water surface. These are not easily intercepted. The USS Stark was nearly sunk by a single French exocet in 1987. A coordinated salvo of 12 to 20 Noor missiles fired from dispersed mobile launchers along a 400-kilometer coastline presents a layered saturation problem that strains any Aegis combat systems engagement queue. Second, Iran's Shahed and Mohajer drone families, not as standalone weapons, but as targeting and saturation assets. The operational doctrine, tested extensively in Yemen via Houthi proxies, uses drones to force air defense systems to expend missiles against low-cost targets, degrading interceptor inventory before the high-value strike arrives. U.S. Navy destroyers carry approximately 90 to 96 standard missiles in their Mk-41 vertical launch cells. An engagement that forces expenditure of 40 to 50 of those interceptors against drone swarms before the anti-ship cruise missile salvo arrives is not a scenario the Fifth Fleet faces lightly. Third, and this is what most civilian analysts are not discussing, Iran's Fateh 110 and Zolfaghar short-range ballistic missiles, with ranges of 300 and 700 kilometers respectively, are pre-positioned to reach every U.S. base in the region. Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, Ali Al Salam in Kuwait. We know from the January 2020 al-Assad strike that Iran can achieve CEP, circular error probable, of approximately 50 to 100 meters with GPS-guided variants. That means these are not weapons of terror. They are precision weapons of denial. What most analysts are missing in the current scenario is the interaction effect between these three systems. Iran does not need to sink a carrier to achieve its strategic objective. It needs to demonstrate that the cost of military action inside Iran, specifically targeting nuclear infrastructure or IRGC command nodes, exceeds what Washington is willing to absorb. A scenario in which 2 U.S. destroyers are damaged, 1 tanker is sunk in the Strait of Hormuz, and an airbase in Qatar sustains 30% runway degradation may not constitute a military defeat for the United States. But it constitutes a political catastrophe, a $30 crude oil spike, and a fundamental reassessment of U.S. power projection credibility in the region. The military equation has changed, not because Iran has become invincible, but because the threshold for demonstrated cost has dropped to a level that a domestic U.S. political environment cannot easily absorb. We cannot analyze this crisis without understanding the three-way strategic calculus that runs beneath it, and that most financial audiences never see clearly. For Russia, a U.S.-Iran military escalation is not a threat. It is an opportunity structure. Every U.S. carrier strike group repositioned to the Persian Gulf is a carrier strike group not operating in the Norwegian Sea or the Black Sea. Every USAF squadron surge to Al Udeid is a squadron not available for rapid deployment to Eastern Europe. Russian military planners understand burden distribution. They do not need to coordinate with Iran to benefit from Iran's actions. They simply need to watch the inventory. For China, the calculus is more complex and more consequential. China imports approximately 1.8 million barrels of Iranian crude per day, most of it in violation of U.S. sanctions through what Beijing calls gray market arrangements. A U.S.-Iran war that closes Hormuz does not hurt China less than it hurts everyone else. It hurts China more, because China has limited strategic petroleum reserve capacity relative to its consumption, and because approximately 80% of all Chinese energy imports transit the Strait of Malacca to the Indian Ocean, a route that runs adjacent to Hormuz-dependent supply chains. This creates a fascinating paradox. Beijing wants to see Iran survive as a strategic counterweight to U.S. influence. Beijing does not want to see Hormuz closed. Those two objectives are in direct tension right now. How China expresses that tension through back-channel diplomatic pressure on Tehran, through public statements, through naval positioning in the Indian Ocean, is one of the most important signals to watch in the next 72 hours. For Iran itself, the strategic calculation is about survival architecture. The IRGC leadership has operated for 45 years on a doctrine of calibrated escalation. Push hard enough to demonstrate resolve. Stop short of triggering a response that threatens the regime's existence. The question that military planners in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh are now asking is whether that doctrine still holds, whether the individuals currently making decisions in Tehran have the institutional memory and restraint that characterized an earlier generation of IRGC leadership, or whether the combination of internal political pressure and external military provocation has compressed the decision space to a point where miscalculation becomes probable. That is the variable that no satellite can measure, and it is the variable that will determine whether Monday morning is a crisis or a catastrophe. Behind the military movements, there are diplomatic timelines that are not being publicly reported, but which intelligence community sources and regional diplomatic circuits have allowed to surface indirectly. The framework nuclear negotiation that resumed in Geneva 6 weeks ago, the fourth attempt at a modified JCPOA structure, reached what one European diplomatic source described as a constructive impasse on Thursday. That phrase in diplomatic vocabulary means that both sides have identified what an agreement requires, and neither side has domestic political authorization to accept it. The Iranians need enrichment at 60% to remain non-negotiable. Washington needs enrichment capped at 20% to bring a deal to the Senate. Those positions have not moved in 3 rounds of talks. The informal deadline that European mediators set for a signal of flexibility was this Friday. That deadline passed without a signal. The escalation that followed, the IRGC maritime exercises, the repositioning of U.S. naval assets, is not coincidental. Both sides are communicating through military posture because the diplomatic channel has gone silent. On Capitol Hill, the political dimension is acute. The expanded AUMF designation that the administration issued Friday will face immediate legal challenge from a bipartisan group of senators who argue, with constitutional merit, that executive branch expansion of military engagement authority without congressional authorization violates the War Powers Resolution. Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman is expected to hold emergency hearings as early as Tuesday. That timeline matters because it constrains what the administration can authorize militarily over the next 72 to 96 hours before domestic political resistance hardens. In Tehran, the domestic political pressure runs in the opposite direction. The IRGC is not a unified actor. There is a documented tension between its aerospace and naval commands on the question of escalation pace. The Aerospace Command, emboldened by what it considers successful drone campaigns in proxy theaters, has reportedly pushed for more direct action. The Naval Command, which understands Hormuz interdiction risk more concretely, has historically been more cautious. Which faction is dominant in the current moment is a live intelligence question. Now let us talk about what this means in the concrete, measurable terms that affect markets, portfolios, supply chains, and the daily lives of people who have no interest in military doctrine but will feel its consequences regardless. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a shipping lane. It is the single most consequential geographic choke point in the global energy system. Approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products transit the strait daily, roughly 21% of global petroleum liquidity. There is no adequate alternative. The East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia has a capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day. The Omani overland routes are minimal. A credible closure of Hormuz, even a partial contested closure that raises insurance and routing risk without fully stopping traffic, would remove 15 to 16 million barrels per day from global supply chains within 72 hours of the threat becoming kinetic. The price models are not complex. Every 1 million barrel per day supply disruption in a tight market historically corresponds to a $4 to $7 per barrel crude increase. A 15 million barrel disruption, even partial and temporary, implies a crude price shock of $60 to $100 per barrel above current prices. With Brent crude closing Friday around $87, the models suggest a credible Hormuz interdiction scenario pushes crude to $140 to $180 within 72 hours of confirmed hostilities. That crude price, transmitted through gasoline and diesel to transportation costs, adds approximately 8 to 14 cents per mile to commercial trucking costs in the United States within 2 weeks. That feeds directly into food prices, manufacturing input costs, and retail pricing across every sector that moves physical goods, which is every sector. Silver at $94 before the weekend becomes a very different conversation if crude opens Monday at $110. Silver is simultaneously an industrial metal, with 58% of demand driven by solar panel manufacturing, electronics, and industrial processes, and a monetary metal that behaves as a safe haven in geopolitical crises. In an Iran war scenario, both demand drivers accelerate simultaneously. Industrial hedging by manufacturers facing energy cost shocks coincides with investor safe haven allocation. The resulting price dynamic is not linear. Historical precedent from the 1980 Iran-Iraq War, the 1990 Gulf War, and the 2019 Aramco attacks suggest safe haven metals can move 15 to 30% in the first 72 hours of a genuine conflict initiation. $94 silver in that context may look like the floor rather than the ceiling. The equity markets are a separate but related calculation. The S&P 500 has historically declined 7 to 12% in the first week of a major Middle East military engagement, with energy sector stocks bifurcating sharply, upstream producers surging, airlines and logistics companies collapsing, defense contractors, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, L3Harris, have already seen option positioning that suggests institutional investors are not treating this weekend as routine. The shipping insurance market, which is less visible than equities but arguably more diagnostic, saw war risk premiums on Hormuz transit routes increase 340% on Thursday and Friday. That number, 340%, is not driven by algorithms or retail sentiment. It is driven by professional underwriters at Lloyd's of London who price these contracts for a living and who have more precise intelligence on military positioning than most public sources acknowledge. This alters the risk calculus for every institutional portfolio manager who opens their terminal Monday morning. If you want to understand where this is going before the narrative catches up, these are the specific signals with the highest diagnostic value: oil tanker AIS transponder activity, automatic identification system data available through marine traffic and similar platforms will show whether commercial tanker operators begin voluntarily rerouting away from Hormuz transit, adding 10 to 14 days and $2 to $3 million per voyage to circumnavigate the Arabian Peninsula via the Cape of Good Hope. Voluntary commercial rerouting before any government order is the market's ground truth assessment of kinetic risk. Watch for it Saturday and Sunday. U.S. CENTCOM public statements. The Central Command Public Affairs Office has been unusually quiet for 36 hours. When CENTCOM goes quiet, one of two things is happening. Either a sensitive operation is in progress and operational security demands silence, or leadership is in extended deliberation and has not authorized a public posture yet. Either condition is notable. A CENTCOM statement that explicitly references freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz without caveats would be a significant escalation signal. Iranian state television programming. This sounds almost archaic, but Iranian state TV scheduling is a documented indicator of government crisis posture. Extended religious programming, interruption of normal broadcast schedules, and the appearance of supreme leader statements outside normal address windows have preceded every major Iranian military action in the past 2 decades. Monitor IRIB output through open source feeds. Chinese Foreign Ministry tone. Beijing's Foreign Ministry spokesperson will hold a scheduled press briefing Monday morning Beijing time, which is Sunday night U.S. time. The specific language used regarding regional stability and whether China calls for restraint by all parties versus restraint by escalating parties is a carefully calibrated diplomatic signal. If Beijing names the United States explicitly as an escalating party, that changes the diplomatic architecture significantly. Comex silver open interest and gold-silver ratio at Monday's open. If silver gaps up more than $4 at the open and the gold-silver ratio compresses below 36, meaning silver is strengthening faster than gold, that indicates industrial hedge demand is driving the move, not pure safe haven allocation. That distinction tells you whether the market believes this is a financial shock or a supply chain shock. Both are serious. They require different portfolio responses. The next 48 hours are critical, and the signals are already being transmitted for those watching the right channels. Step back from the immediate crisis, and the question becomes larger and more consequential. Not, will there be strikes this weekend, but what does the structural escalation we are witnessing tell us about the next decade of international order? The answer, when examined carefully, is uncomfortable. We are observing the operational stress testing of a deterrence architecture that was designed in a different world. The post-Cold War assumption that U.S. military supremacy was so overwhelming that regional actors would not meaningfully contest it has been eroding for 15 years. What Iran, Houthi proxies, and similar actors have demonstrated is not that they can defeat the United States militarily. It is that they can impose costs that exceed the political threshold the domestic U.S. environment is willing to sustain, particularly in a polarized political moment when any military engagement becomes a partisan battlefield before the first aircraft lands. This is the deterrence gap that strategic competitors have been studying and exploiting. Russia studied it in Ukraine's early years. China studied it in the South China Sea. Iran has been studying it since 2019. The lesson they have each derived independently is that the United States retains overwhelming military capability, but has a political cost tolerance that is finite, visible, and exploitable. A U.S.-Iran military exchange that damages U.S. assets, spikes oil prices by $60, and triggers a domestic debate about war powers authority without achieving clear military objectives, without dismantling Iran's nuclear program, without producing regime change, without establishing a new regional equilibrium, would be the most significant demonstration of American strategic limitation since the Afghanistan withdrawal, not because of what it destroys, but because of what it reveals. And that revelation, more than any single military outcome, is what China is watching with the greatest attention. Because the scenario that Beijing is ultimately gaming, Taiwan, the South China Sea, the broader question of Indo-Pacific order, runs through the same political military calculus. If Washington cannot sustain political will to absorb costs in the Persian Gulf, the assessment of what Washington will absorb in defense of Taiwan becomes a live strategic variable in Beijing's planning. This is not conjecture. This is the documented logic of extended deterrence theory, and it is what military planners in every major capital are recalculating right now. The strategic balance is shifting, not because of this single weekend, but because of what this weekend represents in a longer sequence that started long before silver hit $94 and will continue long after this particular crisis resolves or escalates. We do not know what this weekend will produce. That is not a caveat or a hedge. It is the most important analytical statement we can make. The range of outcomes, from a negotiated de-escalation reached through back-channel pressure on Saturday, to a limited exchange of strikes that both sides characterize as calibrated, to a full Hormuz interdiction attempt that restructures the global energy market for months, is genuinely wide. And the financial system, which closed on Friday with silver at $94 and crude at 87s, has not fully priced the upper end of that range. What we can say with precision is this: the structural conditions for a major escalatory event are more fully assembled than at any point since the 2020 Soleimani assassination. The legal authorities have expanded, the military posture is forward, the diplomatic channel is cold, the domestic political constraints on restraint are operating in both capitals simultaneously. The world that opens on Monday morning may look different from the world that closed on Friday afternoon. And if it does, $94 silver will be a footnote. The last price that existed before the market understood what was actually happening. Watch the signals, watch the channels, watch the tankers, the statements, and the open interest. Not because certainty is available, it is not, but because informed observation is the only rational posture available when the decisions that matter are being made in rooms without windows, on a weekend when the markets are closed and the warships are not. The next 24 hours will tell us whether this is the crisis that gets managed or the one that gets remembered. If this analysis added clarity to a situation most outlets are not covering with sufficient depth, subscribe for every update. The next 24 hours will tell us everything. Silver, $94.17. Brent, crude, $87.40. Hormuz, status, contested. Comex, opens, Monday, 8:20 EST.